What's up, guys? Eris here. Today I want to talk about the age-old comparison between pads versus arcade sticks, and this is going to be in the context of fighting games, of course. And most of the stuff I have to say is going to apply to Tekken, but some of the stuff that I have to say will apply to all fighting games. Um, the point I want to make here is I want to talk about which I think is more effective when it comes to choice. And I think there's a lot of aspects to that. So first you have to consider what really is an arcade stick and what is a pad. It really breaks down to what you can do with your left hand versus what you can do with your right hand. And starting with, let's say, an arcade stick, if you start with your left hand, in Tekken, for example, movement is going to be much more difficult on an arcade stick. And there are several reasons for that. First of all, if you just start with the basics, an arcade stick has a large range of motion. So from neutral to, let's say, forward, that is quite a distance to achieve. So something like Shining Wizard, right? Forward, neutral, is actually not very easy to accomplish on a stick. But when you look at a pad, there's such a small range of movement that needs to happen. Forward is so easily doable. I mean, both require practice, of course, but just physically, the distance between neutral and forward, or neutral in any direction, is much greater on a stick than it is on a pad. So, for that reason, just physically, I think pad is advantageous to the left hand. Now, when it comes to more specifically, something like Korean backdash in Tekken, which is done. I mean, I don't want to go over exactly how you do it, but the point is that you do it with your left hand, obviously, and on most players can do it much better on one player's side, including myself, because it's done with your fingers. Similar to this. You just do it with your fingers, no problem. However, if you are on the two-player side, doing it must be done with your entire arm. You need to put the ball top between your fingers, and you need to do this kind of motion. And this can be very taxing on your arm, and also it's very difficult to do. Just look at all the things your arm, the range of movement your arm has to have. So it's very difficult to do. Now, when it comes to comparing that to a pad, two-player side, easy. One-player side, easy. So as far as movement goes, I think without a doubt, pad is advantageous. And movement is arguably the most important thing in Tekken. So I think it's important to consider that. And then the next thing to talk about is your right hand. Now, I think it cannot be argued that arcade sticks have the advantage when it comes to your right hand. And that is because the buttons are spaced out far apart. It's easy to hit combinations of buttons, very easy, as well as the ability to drum buttons. So on a pad, if you're using your thumb, for example, you just have one opportunity to hit buttons, or you could just mash like this. But on a stick, you have the ability to drum. And drumming buttons is an advanced tactic that most Street Fighter players use, but it's also very useful in Tekken, especially when it comes to just frames. So it gives you the opportunity to hit the button once, release it to neutral, and hit the button again, giving you two potential inputs. In Street Fighter, because of negative edge, it actually is four, because each depression and then release counts as one input. So in that regard, obviously, sticks have an advantage. But is it really that big of an advantage? I mean, that's really up to you. I have to say that when it comes to Tekken players, for example, this past Evo, 5 out of the top 8 Tekken players were pad players. And Tokido was one of the remaining stick players. He's Japanese. One of the other ones was Ryan Hart, and the third one was Mr. Naps. So the thing is that in the Western world, in all of Europe and mostly everywhere other than Korea and Japan, all of the top players, with the exception of only a few, are pad players. And I think it's important to think about that because in Japan, they don't play on console as well as in Korea. If they do play on console, they only do it for practice. They don't play competitively on console. And the last thing that I'm kind of backtracking a little bit, but the last thing that I think it's important to mention when comparing these two is a pad is completely quiet. Now, I've made this argument before, and some people seem to disagree with me, but especially in a scenario where you're trying to raw parry or do something that's like a counter or a sabaki or anything that requires the opponent to do something and then for you to do something in reaction to that, obviously it is much easier to do that type of thing against a stick player. Because if you're waiting and it's tense and you're waiting for an attack, you get to hear the attack as well as see it on the screen. And that is a major advantage. For example, in a game like Soul Calibur, you have guard impacts. You can hear the attack that you're going to guard impact as well as see it. While on a pad, you have to see it. And I think that's a lot bigger, that's a much bigger factor than most people consider. In Japan, they play on back-to-back cabinets. Same in Korea. And this is not an issue. And when Japanese players come to America and they start playing side to side on a console, I remember when Al was here, he was putting a blanket over his hands to make it more quiet when he was playing. I mean, it obviously is a factor. So that's another factor in the comparison. But I think the key thing that people have to remember when it comes to comparing these two is that if you are competing in a fighting game and you're trying to be the best in the best in the world happens to reside in Japan and Korea. And unfortunately, the best players in the United States use these. And what that means is the best players in the United States will never be able to be the best players in the world. Now let me explain myself. I, for example, have been to Japan. And the first time I went to Japan, I went with Chet Shetty. And Chet Shetty is a pad player, a PAL player. And we both went to Japan, and he unfortunately got his ass kicked by most of the players there because he wasn't able to play to his fullest because we were playing in an arcade. Now, there was an era where arcades had pad ports, but that era has come and gone. And at this point, if you want to compete with the best in the world, you have to be able to play on stick. Now, even though, in my opinion, pads are advantageous, as a top player, you are holding yourself back from being the best in the world if you play on pad. And people may argue that, oh, Tekken Crash installed pad ports for the Americans that went over there to play against the Koreans. But it has been confirmed that the pad ports they installed were laggy. And this is going to happen forever. You know, you cannot expect to be able to take something that is meant for a home console and plug it into an arcade and compete with the best in the world. So the conclusion here is that though I think pad is advantageous, I think that if you're trying to be the best player that you could possibly be, stick has the hidden advantage of allowing you to play against the best in the world. And I think that's something that, in the grand scheme of things, a competitive player has to consider. So, even though I would never play Tekken on a pad, as a competitive Tekken player, I naturally am an arcade purist and I would play on a stick. But for those of you who are kind of on the fence, considering which to use, I think it's important to remember that though pad is easier to use and it can accomplish everything that a stick can accomplish, the only thing that you won't be able to accomplish with a pad is to be able to play the best players in the world. So consider how serious you are about being a Tekken player. Anyway, that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. Do me a solid and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and I guess I'll catch you guys next time.